Now the topic before us is beyond the visible, analyzing balance of invisible trade in three scenarios. Here we are going to discuss balance of invisible trade. Suppose this is our country and this is the rest of world. We may be having certain goods which are in abundance, and so we export goods to the rest of the world. At the same time, we may be having shortage of certain goods, so we import goods, certain goods from the rest of the world. At the same time, we also export or provide services to the rest of the world, and the services such as banking, insurance, shipping, transport, export of services, providing of services to the rest of the world. In certain areas, we may be requiring the services from the rest of the world. So there is import of certain services. Import of services. So as a whole, we as a nation do export and import of goods and services. When here we are to talk about balance of invisible trade, what is the meaning of I? I means invisible. Invisible trade means trade which is cannot be seen. Invisible items means those items which cannot be seen, touched or measured. So here when we are to discuss balance of invisible trade, we will be discussing only about export and import of services. So in case of BOIT, we will be taking into account export and import of services. So balance of invisible trade is equal to or difference between the value of export of services minus import of services, or value of export of invisible items and import of invisible items. So it is the difference between a country's invisible exports and invisible imports. Balance of invisible trade is also known as balance of trade on services. It is a key component of balance of payment. We discussed that balance of payment has three components: current account, capital account and financial account, and balance of invisible trade comes under the head current account. Invisible exports means services sold or provided to rest of the world or other countries. On the other hand, invisible imports means services taken or purchased from rest of the world or other countries. Examples of invisible trade are services such as banking, insurance, tourism, transportation, other professional services such as consulting, engineering. So balance of invisible trade, invisible exports minus invisible imports. Here we will be taking into account value of invisible exports and value of invisible imports. So the balance of invisible trade may be surplus, deficit or balanced. Surplus balance of invisible trade occurs when export of invisible trade is more than import of invisible trade. Deficit balance of invisible trade occurs when export of invisible trade is less than import of invisible trade. Now the balanced BOIT occurs when export of services, value of export of services or value of export of invisible items is equal to import of services. When we are talking about balanced BOIT, here we will be taking into account that exports are roughly equal to import. We will be not taking into account 1:1 ratio. No. If the exports are say 6 billion, then 5.99 billion will be taken as balanced BOIT. Both the sides should be roughly equal to each other. The balance of invisible trade has a significant impact on the country's economy. If the country's exports are more than the imports, that is, economy is having surplus balance of invisible trade, then it means that it is getting more foreign exchange. That is, exports are more, imports are less, so it is there is net flow of foreign exchange. So it may utilize this excess money which is it is getting due to high exports for improving its economy, or it may use it to reduce its debt. On the other hand, if a country is having deficit balance of invisible trade, that is, imports are more in comparison to exports, so it will have to pay foreign exchange to the rest of the world for the imports. It means that suppose exports are 100, whereas imports are to the tune of 150. So what is difference? Minus 50. This is deficit balance of invisible trade. So it will have to pay 50 to the rest of the world. So to pay 50 to the rest of the world, either the country will have to borrow or it will have to sell its assets or use some other means. I hope you have understood all the three scenarios of balance of invisible trade, and that too in a very simple language. Thanks for watching. If now the topic before us is current account versus balance of trade. We will now understand the difference between current account and balance of trade. In case of current account, we know that there are four components. What first is visible items, then come invisible items, then come unilateral transfers, and the fourth is income from investments. These are the four components of current account. Current account itself is one of the components of balance of payments. So when we are talking, we are here to understand the difference between current account and balance of trade. The balance of trade is only concerned with these two. visible items and invisible items. Visible items means goods, which are goods can be seen, touched and measured. So these are called visible items. Invisible items means services which cannot be seen, touched, measured. And the examples of the same are shipping, banking, insurance, transportation, etc. Balance of trade is the difference between exports and imports. That is, exports minus imports is balance of trade, the value of exports minus value of imports. Here we are talking about exports of the country as a whole, imports of the country as a whole, all the exports which take place between the country and the rest of the world. So here is a brief overview of this. All is a brief overview of current account. As already told earlier that in the case of current account, we record transactions on the debit side and on the credit side. All the transactions because of which there is inflow of foreign exchange, they are recorded on credit side. If there is inflow of foreign exchange, all those transactions on account of which there is outflow of foreign exchange, they are recorded on debit side. When we export goods or export services, we receive foreign exchange, so they are recorded on debit side. When we import goods and services, there is outflow of foreign exchange, so they are recorded on debit side. When we make unilateral transfers, that is, there are one-time transfers also, that is, we may be giving aid to other countries on humanitarian ground. So these are one-time transfers for which no return is expected. We may be providing food, medicines to the rest of the world in case there is any humanitarian problem in any country of the world. So these are one-time transfers, unilateral transfers, for which nothing is expected in return. In the same way, when we receive unilateral transfers from the rest of the world on humanitarian ground, etc., then they are recorded on debit side because there is outflow of foreign exchange. If we give, it is unilateral transfer. When we give unilateral transfers, there is outflow. When we receive unilateral transfers from abroad, it is recorded on the credit side because foreign exchange comes into our country. When we receive income on investments in the shape of dividend, interest, etc., there is inflow, so they are recorded on credit side. And if we make payments or the foreigners receive payments for their investments in the shape of interest, dividend, profit, then it is recorded on debit side because there is outflow. So here, this is whole is current account. And if we are to talk about balance of trade is only concerned with only these two items. This is balance of trade, the difference between exports and imports. Now we will have an overview of current difference between current account and balance of trade. Current account is an account or one of the components of balance of payments where we record exports and imports of goods and services, unilateral transfers paid and received, and investment income received and paid. And all these transactions are recorded when they take place between the residents of a country and the rest of the world. On the other hand, balance of trade is the difference between a country's exports and imports of goods and services. If we say that balance of trade is only concerned only with export and import of goods, it is the narrower definition of balance of trade. It If we say that balance of trade is only concerned with goods, then it may also be called balance of visible trade. If we say that balance of trade is concerned only with services, it will be called as balance of invisible trade. So when we are talking about balance of trade, we will be taking into account both goods and services, because this is the broader aspect. We cannot ignore the role of services in export and import of the country. Services play an important role in any economy. So when we are talking about balance of trade, we should have a broad overview and should also include services in the case of balance of trade. Now, what are the components of balance of trade? We have already discussed that visible items, invisible items, investment income and unilateral transfers are the components of balance of trade. And in the case of balance of trade, the components are visible goods, or we can simply say goods and services only. We do not take into account unilateral transfers and investment income in the case of balance of trade. We are only concerned with goods and services in case of balance of trade. Now, settlement. Current account deficit cannot be financed by balance of trade. What it means? When we record all these transactions, suppose it is 1000, it is 500, it is 200, it is 150, it is 100, it is 90, it is say 700, it is say 600. And when we make total of the debit side and credit side, what it means? What comes? It comes 2000, 1000, 700, 200 and 100. Zero, zero, no, 7, 1340. Okay, you can see that here inflow is less, whereas outflow is more. So here is deficit of 660. It is deficit minus 660. The figures are in negative. Here the difference current account is deficit. So whether this deficit can be filled by export of goods, difference between export and whether if we do exports, if we are earning more from exports as compared to say if the figures are more in exports, whether it can be met, this deficit can be met by here balance of trade. No, because we have already, this is the figure which is arrived at only by totaling debit and credit side. So here the deficit, if any, the current account cannot be met by balance of trade, because balance of trade itself a part of current account. But balance of trade, if there is deficit in balance of trade, it may be met, or we can say that other parts of current account can play a supportive role in mitigating the overall impact of deficit in BOT, can be partially offset by other parts of the current account. What it means? It means that suppose there is a deficit in balance of trade. What it means? It means that if imports are more than exports, suppose this is the situation, what happens? We will have to pay. So these two parts, other parts of the current account can play a supportive role in reducing the impact of of current deficit of balance of trade. Suppose there is difference of say in export and import, there is difference of say 200. Suppose we assume that there are negative figures, imports are more as compared to exports. So these two items, unilateral transfers and income, can play some role in reducing this negative figure to some extent, but we cannot say that all of the negative impact of balance of trade will be absorbed by these two items, unilateral transfers and income. No, they can play only some role, not completely wipe out the impact of negative balance of trade. We will again read, other parts of current account can play a supportive role in mitigating the overall impact of deficit in balance of trade. Overall impact of the deficit by by partially offsetting the same. Now the topic before us is understanding the capital account in balance of payments. We have already discussed that balance of payment has three components: current account, capital account, and financial account. We have already learned that in the case of current account, we have four components, that is export and import of goods, export and import of services, unilateral transfers paid and received, and investment income paid and received. Here, in the case of capital account, we record the transactions which are related to acquisition and disposal of non-produced and non-financial assets. What is the meaning of non-produced non-financial assets? Non-produced non-financial assets are those assets which are not produced. They occur naturally, or some intellectual work is involved therein. For example, land, natural resources such as mining rights, fishing rights, logos, trademarks, copyrights, all these come under non-produced and non-financial assets. And the we also record in the capital account capital transfers. If a country has to take debt, has given debt to a for other country, and naturally it will receive the same at some point in time in future. If the country forgives its right to receive, that is, debt forgiveness is given by the country to the other country, it is also recorded in the capital transfer. If the migrant workers move from one country to another and take their assets along them, then they are also recorded in capital transfers. So in the case of capital account, we record transactions related to non-produced and non-financial assets and capital transfers which take place between the residents of a country and the rest of the world. Non-produced non-financial assets are not created through production. They are not produced, these assets which are recorded in capital account. These are those assets which are not produced. They exist naturally. Land exists naturally. Intellectual properties such as patents, trademarks, brand names, logos, brand names are created through intellectual effort. The transactions related to these are recorded in capital account. These assets do not directly generate income, but they hold economic value. The examples of the non-produced non-financial assets is given as land, natural resources, minerals, oils, fishing rights, intellectual property, etc. Now, capital transfers are also recorded in capital account. What is the capital transfers? It often represents the change in financial obligations or the claims between parties. First is debt forgiveness. Then one country may give certain grants to other countries only for investment purpose in a specific project, and it does not expect to receive the same. There is no expectation that it will receive the grant back. So all these investment grants which are given by a country to the other countries for specific projects are recorded in the capital account. Then the assets which are moved when people change countries of residence are also recorded in capital account. Now here we take into account certain examples and how they are recorded in capital account. When a foreign company buys the land in our country, what happens? There is inflow of foreign exchange. Foreign exchange comes into our country. This is recorded on credit side of the capital account. When a resident of our country buys the land in some foreign country, or buys the land say in our own country but from a foreigner, a foreigner is having say certain land in our country and our resident buys the same, or we buy a foreign asset located in the other country, what happens? There is capital outflow. Here location is not to be taken into consideration whether the asset is located here or in some other country. Here we are to take the direction of capital, whether the capital will flow outside or capital will flow inside. If the capital will flow inside, it is to be recorded on credit side. If the outflow foreign exchange will be towards outside, that is the foreign exchange will go outside of our country, then it is to be recorded on debit side. When a country receives capital transfer, debt forgiveness or investment grant, that is when our country receives investment grant from some other country, or some other country forgives its right to claim debt from us which they had given to us at some time in the past, then it is recorded as credit entry, because we will not have to repay that, whether it is debt or investment grant. When our country forgives debt of another nation, it is debt and debit entry. Here capital outflow is involved because we have relinquished our right to receive the debt. I hope you might have understood the concept of capital account, which is one of the components of balance of payment in a very simple and easy language. Thanks for watching. If you like our course, please spare some time to give a star rating to our course.